Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Small prairie towns are supposed to be peaceful and quiet, even if there are divisions, even if some people don't really get along. There's often no choice but to mostly smile and pretend. The town's just too small for open hostility. Everyone knows everyone. So those divisions remain hidden, simmering, until something shows up that cannot be ignored.
An extremist cult leader and her followers have set up camp in a small Saskatchewan community. The self-proclaimed Queen of Canada has offered up threats, even calling for a public execution of elected officials.
When the so-called Queen and her followers arrived in Richmound, Saskatchewan, it was assumed that they would hang out for a while and move on. That's what they had been doing across the country. But months have passed. Close to a year, in fact. And they're still here. They're entrenched. And during that time, the presence of extremists has laid bare anything that was simmering in Richmound. In a town where everyone knows everyone, what happens when a cult moves in next door and everyone has to pick a side? Nothing good. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Rachel Browne is an investigative journalist. She looked into what's been happening in Richmound for the Walrus. Hey, Rachel.
Hey, Jordan.
Why don't we set the scene? And I think a few people listening are already familiar with how this story begins, but maybe not where it's gotten to now. But where's Richmound, Saskatchewan, and why are we talking about this tiny little place?
Yeah, Richmound, which I'm sure many people had never heard of before. It's this tiny town of just over 100 people right near the Alberta border. So it's about an hour east of Medicine Hat by car. It's this tiny town that has about 65 homes within a half a square kilometer. And it's, like I said, it's surrounded by farmland. So it's mostly people who want to live there and get a bit of peace and quiet. There's cheap real estate. It's where a lot of people raise their young families or go to retire as well.
And sort of in the middle of that community, or maybe not quite in the middle, is a whole other group of people. How did they show up?
Yeah, so you have the so-called Queen of Canada, Romana Didulo, and her group, a dozen or so of them. They pulled into town last September. They had been kicked out of a town called Kamsack on the far east of the province of Saskatchewan, so right near the Manitoba border, just shortly before that. And they were looking for a place to land, a place where they could put down roots after a months-long royal tour of sorts across Canada. And Richmound ended up being the place where they've been ever since.
For a brief refresher, we have covered her on this show before. I think most people know who she is, but the Queen of Canada, where did she come from? Maybe that's where to start, because I think you got a little bit more into her origin story and her background than I'd seen before.
Yeah, and I have to give a lot of credit to my former vice colleague, Mac Lamoureux, who's been following Romana Didulo's rise for years. He's probably the best reporter who's been following her from the beginning. There's not too much that we know about Romana Didulo's early life. It was around 1990 when she was a teenager, so she's now in her 50s. And she immigrated to British Columbia from the Philippines. And, later on in life, in her career, she ran a recruiting firm for the oil and gas sector. And then again, we don't really know too much about her life, professionally or private life, until about 2020, when she founded this fringe political party called the Canada First Party, really borrowing language from the American Republican Party, saying things like draining the swamp in Ottawa.
Right.
So she starts this party and then from there goes on to fill this power vacuum that had been left at the end of 2020, 2021 or so in the QAnon community. So from there is when she rose to prominence as this QAnon leader, this conspiracy theorist, and she's really, taken off ever since then.
And over the course of the next couple years, I guess, she traveled around Canada with her followers, issuing royal decrees and all the stuff that our listeners probably have heard of. Before eventually settling in Richmound, as you described, what was the town's initial reaction to this person and her followers just kind of appearing there, of all places?
Yeah, the town's initial reaction when this cohort of RVs with this purple and white flag on it, RVs with this woman's face on it, a lot of them were super confused. And once they kind of realized what this group is, who this woman was, and the types of harmful rhetoric that she'd been spewing for a long time, they became outraged and horrified that there was this group that was putting down roots in their town, that it was making Richmound their home. So dozens of locals came together and protested the presence of this group in town. People from outside communities came in. The RCMP even sent a temporary detachment in case things really went south. So they were honking their horns, circling around the abandoned school property where they'd moved into, held up signs that said things like royal decrees are lying disease and your kingdom doesn't belong in our countryside. So they were really riled up and angry. And that anger has been sustained ever since they arrived.
Did any of them imagine at the time, and again, Didulo had kind of paused in a couple of places before, but did any of them imagine that, nearly a year later, they'd just still be there?
No. Most locals I talked to had hoped the group would have left by the time winter came around. So they rolled in around September, and the prairie winters can get really, really cold. So they were hoping basically that the group would be frozen out. But they lasted through the winter in that school. And so by the time spring came around this year, locals were thinking, okay, now the weather's warmed up. She's probably going to want to go back on the road like she had last year. And yet they are still there. They're still in the school. And now we're, in the middle of June, and they're starting to till the soil around the school. They actually just started painting the school this really bright purple to match her, so-called royal colors. So they are, I think, there for the long haul, as far as we can tell.
What have they done to that school, and how are they living in it? Do we have any idea? I guess they don't let people in.
No, they don't let outsiders in except for the inner circle and a couple of locals, like the man who owns the school and another woman as well, who are basically more or less supportive of the group, have actually been made ministers in Didulo's fantasy cabinet. The glimpses that outsiders get into the school come from the live streams that the group does every night from inside the school. So we really just don't have much of a sense of how they're living, what the conditions are like inside. I know there's some concerns that there's some bylaw infractions, that there was a few months ago issues around a heater being near a propane tank, which is a fire hazard. But from the outside, a lot of locals who drive past the school every day, it's right in the middle of town. They're upset to see this construction fencing around the school, these RVs parked outside, and now, like I said, this really bright purple color that they're just painting the entire school with. So for a lot of locals, it's a big eyesore and, sort of a reminder on a daily basis that there's this cult amongst them.
You mentioned that the anger that showed up initially when they arrived has mostly been sustained, but not with everyone. And how has Didulo's presence changed this town?
Her presence in town and the group's presence in town has really emphasized and underscored pre-existing tensions and flare-ups that existed well before she got there. I think what I tried to explore is how conspiracy theories and groups like this thrive in environments where there's already polarization and conflict. So I go into how there's this woman in town who's lived there for a couple of years prior to when Didulo arrived, Melinda Fisher, who had, taken it upon herself to try to expose and bring down the local government, the mayor and town council. So she had already had a lot of tensions with her neighbors and with the local government, which she sees as corrupt and, basically not acting in the best interest of the town. And then there's the guy who owns the school, Rick Mans, who himself was already, a QAnon believer. Neighbors described him as a conspiracy theorist. So this town in many ways was primed for the presence of a group like this, which I think is sort of a small-scale example of how conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists thrive. It requires, like I said, polarization, but also people looking for opportunities on either side, I think.
And in a community this small, I guess it doesn't take all that much to shift the balance of power, right? How are Fisher and others trying to, I don't know if incorporate's the right word, because clearly this group does not want to be incorporated into the town, but trying to use them to their advantage?
Yeah, I was really struck at how this is all playing out. So when you think about it, this town of 120 people, when you have an influx of Didulo and her 12 followers, that's around, it represents around 10% of the population. So for people like Melinda Fisher, who have a bone to pick with the town council, there's an election coming up in a few months. She told me she saw this sudden arrival of this group of people as a potential opportunity for her to help sway the next election, to have a voting bloc come into town that she could, whether or not this ends up actually being the case, she could use to basically bring down the local government.
How is the town now reacting to this? I don't know whether I should call it a coup attempt or what, because I haven't actually done anything yet, but she's trying to get them votes. How is she doing that, and what's the town doing to stop it?
So earlier this year, Melinda put Didulo and 11 or 12 of her followers on one of the titles to a piece of land that she has in Richmound. So for her, she says, I'm putting these people on the land title. It's going to give them a vote in town. It's going to cement their place in Richmound. And not only is that going to be great because it's going to make my neighbors, who I'm already mad at for a number of different reasons, it's going to further annoy them. And then also it could potentially give these people the ability to vote in the municipal election. So that's how that's playing out. And a lot of the other locals who are very disturbed and enraged at the presence of the cult in town, they were just horrified at yet another example of how this group is entrenching themselves into Richmond, showing no sign that they're leaving anytime soon. So they were angry, but they're also frustrated because unless the group is out there breaking the law, committing crimes, there's really not much they can do because they're on private property. They're on this land that is owned by a man in town. And so it's sort of like a sit around and wait for the worst case scenario for something to actually be done. So it's very frustrating.
You mentioned the worst case scenario, and I'm not asking you or anyone else to speculate, but what are they doing there? Are they doing anything in town? I guess, and I asked this question the first time we talked to somebody when they had just gotten there, and the feeling was like, well, they'd camp there for a while and take off. But are they turning this into a compound? What is their ultimate plan?
It's a good question. I think it's clear that this school has become their compound. It's more or less become their headquarters. They're very insular, though, so they're not out there. When I was in Richmond, I didn't see anyone off the property. I saw a couple of quote-unquote security guards encircling the school from behind the fence, but they're not out there interacting with locals. They're not going to community events. They're barely, some people may go out and pick up things from the store now and again, but they're not out there, directly interacting with the local population. What they are doing is spewing a lot of violent rhetoric, a lot of problematic rhetoric. We see the impact of this group's ideology across the country. Far outside of Richmond, people are losing their homes, their cars. They're not paying their hydro bills because the Queen apparently by decree says they don't have to. But in all honesty, in terms of a day-to-day impact that this group is having on town, there aren't these daily flare-ups or altercations between them. I mean, Rick Mans, the guy who owns the school, was charged with assault last fall after an altercation with a neighbor who had approached the school property. But beyond that, there's nothing specific that the police could charge them with. I mean, I will also say last fall is when the group, or what the locals believe was the group, sent out execution orders by email to a lot of local people saying that if you cross us, if you call us out, you will be publicly executed. But that's another example of the frustration because those messages couldn't be pinned by police to a specific person. Everyone in town knows they came from Didulo or her followers, but they couldn't prove it.
Are the town's councillors or mayor or anything working on a potential solution? Is it just, I mean, execution orders aside, like live and let live at this point if they're not breaking the law?
So recently, a group of Richmound locals set up a GoFundMe to raise funds to support the town's legal fees that they're trying to use to beef up the municipal bylaws to help expedite the removal of this group. So that's the efforts that they're undertaking now. But again, it's this situation where everyone in town is basically stuck in limbo because unless there's a blatant crime that they can pin on Didulo or her group, again, there's just not much they can do if they're operating on private property and not actually harming anyone or committing crimes at the moment. So perhaps down the road, if the town beefs up or changes its bylaws, they'll be able to do something if they can point out that the group is doing something that's in violation of whatever those end up being. But the town is certainly monitoring this all the time. They all drive by the school every day. So they're just waiting for something to happen, something that they can jump on to help oust this group from town.
When you speak to people who live there, what do they think about what's happened to their community? And, you know, I guess what I'm grappling with is like, if they're not actually doing anything other than like painting a school purple and tilling the fields, what has really changed in the town then, practically speaking?
I would say I spoke to a lot of people who said that tension in town is just at an all-time high. People who were friends or at least acquaintances are no longer speaking. In some cases, some have become enemies. There's sort of this accusatory tone that some people take with each other. Like, if you're not with us, then you're with them. And then the people on the other side will say, well, just because I'm not out there protesting and trying to oust them through bylaw infractions, that kind of thing, it doesn't mean I support them. So there's this division in town that has, I think, worsened with the presence of this group. And it's sad to see because it really was this, in a lot of ways, a peaceful place where people could coexist. And sure, it wasn't perfect, but the presence of this group has brought out a lot of people's darker sides, a lot of people's nastier sides. There's infighting, especially on social media, that kind of thing. So it really has, in a lot of ways, poisoned the town. And it's really raw for a lot of people in Richmound. I spoke to at least 5 people who broke down in tears when they described what it was like having to drive past this school every day and have their town become known for something that they see as awful and as for a group that's perpetuating harms across the country. So it really is raw for a lot of people, you know, even though, again, we're not seeing people out on the streets having these altercations with members of the cult, but it is still a really sad thing for the town to have to see on a daily basis.
And I guess when you're in a town with like less than a couple hundred people, the you're with us or you're with them really takes on a whole new form, right? Because everybody knows everyone and there's nowhere to just not stick your neck out if you want to be neutral.
Absolutely. It sort of loses that ability for nuance and empathy and understanding for where people are coming from. So, you know, I know there are efforts. The mayor himself has tried to host kind of closed-door meetings, bringing in a mediator, trying to help people mend divisions that even pre-existed the presence of the cult. So he's really trying to heal the divisions in town. You know, there's some people that are more willing to engage in that than others. But yeah, it's exposed a lot of these raw emotions in town. And I think, again, Richmound represents on a small scale what we see on a broader level when it comes to the impacts of polarization and the impacts of this us versus them mentality.
Rachel, thank you so much for this. A fascinating look at what extremism does in a community, whether it's large or tiny.
Thanks, Jordan.
Rachel Browne, writing in The Walrus. That was The Big Story. For more from us, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can type Rachel's name in the search bar and find a whole bunch of fascinating conversations about her stories. You can send us feedback about this episode or absolutely any other episode by emailing hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling 416-935-5935. This podcast is in your favorite podcast player. It's in a mediocre podcast player. It's even in a bad podcast player. And of course, it's in your smart speaker. Just ask that little device to play The Big Story Podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.